So I'm sorry to everybody for the late start, but we are all good to go now. So let's get started. My name is Samantha Bonwick, and I am the outreach coordinator here at the Pincher Creek Library, and I am so happy to have Elizabeth here to let us know a little bit about the Trumpeter Swan. So before we get started, I would like to acknowledge that we gather at the Pincher Creek District Municipal Library on the traditional land of the Piikani people, both past and present. We honor the land itself and the people who have tended to it throughout the generations so that we may work, learn, play, and grow in its beauty in the present and into the future. Elizabeth Anderson is a conservation biologist with the Waterton Biosphere Reserve, where her focus is largely on species at risk. In the various projects on species at risk, such as northern leopard frogs, little brown bats, and trumpeter swans, Elizabeth works with landowners and the public on identifying locations of the species, understanding habitat requirements, and ultimately maintaining these species on the landscape. We have been lucky enough to welcome Elizabeth to the library before, so I am really excited to let her get started on her presentation tonight. Before we do, I will just let everyone know that you are able to ask questions. If you look in your lower toolbar, there is an icon that says chat. And if you click on there, you're able to type in your question into the chat, and we will be answering questions at the end of Elizabeth's presentation. So besides that, please make sure your mics stay muted, and I will turn it over to Elizabeth.
Great, thank you, Samantha. I'm just going to share my screen here and get rolling. All right, so thanks everyone for joining us tonight. I'm going to give just a little bit of background about the Waterton Biosphere Reserve. I know some of the people on the call are familiar with it, but I'm not sure if everyone is. So I'll give a little bit of background about the Biosphere Reserve and then delve into this wonderful species that we have in our midst during various parts of the year. So the Waterton Biosphere Reserve is largely about finding a balance between people and nature. And this is true of all biosphere reserves. It's a large network of sites both in Canada and actually across the world. So Waterton Biosphere Reserve was designated in 1979, and it's part of UNESCO's Man in the Biosphere program. So to be part of that program, the biosphere reserves are nominated, and then they must meet certain criteria, and this includes the designation of the reserve with a distinct boundary, the conservation of significant ecosystems, and then we must also meet 3 main biosphere reserve functions, and I'll speak to those in just a minute. But mostly I just want you to get the idea that it is an area that is designated with global significance, and there's 19 reserves in Canada, but we're one of over 700 reserves worldwide in over 131 countries. So it's recognized as a really unique area, and a really good demonstration of how we can live in concert with the natural surroundings and the natural resources that we have available. Another way to kind of think of it is that biosphere reserves are models of community-based sustainable use. So it's all about conserving that biodiversity and protecting the traditional livelihoods that are operating on the landscape, while still working to develop local economies, and essentially trying to do all this while maintaining the resources that allow us to be here now, but that we also hope to pass on to our children. They're not prescriptive in any way, not legislated, and so there's no change in designation in provincial lands or municipal or federal or Indigenous lands. Everything remains as it was before the biosphere was identified. But really it's about being that living demonstration of how we can live in concert. As I mentioned, there's 3 functions that a biosphere reserve has to meet. The first is biodiversity conservation, so conservation of the landscapes, ecosystems, species, and even down to the genetic variation. The sustainable development function focuses on the economic and human development that's both socio and culturally relevant as well as ecologically sustainable. And then finally, the last function for biosphere reserves is to improve capacity of the local people, and that's through providing support for research and monitoring, education, information exchange, such as we're doing tonight, as related to local, national, and even global issues of conservation and development. So the Waterton Biosphere Reserve, the core is the red area shown on this map. Of course, that's Waterton Lakes National Park. Each biosphere reserve has a legally designated protected area as the core. And then what we call the blue buffer zone is the next zone out, and that of course includes dominated by ranch land areas, as well as Nature Conservancy of Canada's Waterton Park Farm project, and that also includes the green provincial lands to the north of Waterton Lakes Park. And then our current zone of cooperation is shown here in yellow, and that's the remainder of the MD of Pincher Creek and Cardston County. And I should note that MD of Ranchland has also indicated a desire to join the biosphere, and so our boundary will be expanding in the future, and our map will be updated when that happens. So as Samantha mentioned, I work largely in the Species at Risk program for the Biosphere Reserve, and back in 2015 we put together an action plan. It was sort of the first venture for us into species at risk, and it was looking at what are the species, what species are other organizations, agencies, researchers, what species are they addressing, and are there any gaps where we can contribute. We didn't necessarily want to step on toes, and if someone else is doing great work already, then we wanted to recognize that, but identify where there was areas that we could contribute to what was already been done. So the first project we bit off was the Northern Leopard Frog Project. There's been 3 reintroduction sites in the biosphere. Of course, one in Waterton Lakes National Park, one in Beauvais Provincial Park, and then also in the town of McGrath. And so our Northern Leopard Frog Project looked to see if those populations were expanding onto adjacent lands, and to raise awareness about the species and the threats it faces. We've also embarked on a little brown bat, or bat project in general, we call it, but specifically targeted at little brown myotis. And that's because of the threat. Of course, I'm sure most of you have heard of white nose syndrome and just the devastating impacts it's had on populations in Eastern Canada and the US. And we know it's knocking at Alberta's door. And so we really wanted to provide outreach and awareness and to identify where we do have little brown bat maternity colonies and try and support those colonies so that when white nose syndrome comes, the bats are sort of at their peak population resilience, I guess. They're healthy and they're supported going into that threat. So that work is still ongoing. And if anyone knows of bat colonies that they'd like counted in the late spring, summer, please get in contact with me. And then last year we started into our Trumpeter Swan project. And so that's gonna be the rest of what I speak about tonight. But again, the main purpose was to increase awareness about the Trumpeter swans that use the various water bodies and wetland habitats in Waterton Biosphere Reserve, and to kind of document a bit better what was happening on the ground with these swans. So like I say, I'm going to talk about that. I just wanted to give you one more sneak preview, and that's limber pine, well, limber and whitebark pine. And this is another species under our species at risk program that we are just going to be stepping into the realm of work in this area this coming year. So stay tuned as we develop exactly what that project is going to look like. But essentially, we will be trying to support recovery efforts on private lands. So, Trumpeter Swan Conservation in Waterton Biosphere Reserve. This is just kind of a brief outline of what I'm going to cover tonight. Sort of some general swan biology to give you a better context for why we're interested in swans and why the biological background that feeds into why they are considered under our species at risk program. Then we're also going to look at swans in Waterton and in particular, what's unique about the population that we have using the area. And then our project results from this past year, and that'll kind of give you a little taste for what might be coming this coming year as we delve into our second year of data collection. So there's two swan species that you will regularly see in the area during migration, in particular, the trumpeter swans and the tundra swans. So in the top left picture here, we have trumpeters, top right is tundras, and the bottom middle is what you will actually see very often is a mixed flock. So it gets a little more complicated when they're in a mixed flock, but it is possible to identify them, particularly if you have good scopes or binoculars. The trumpeters most of the ones you see will be indeed migrating all the way through to northern Alberta, northern BC, and into the Yukon. The tundra swans are going to, well, the tundra. So the tundras are moving quite a bit further along. So how do we tell them apart? Well, there's sort of some key features in the head area that we look at to identify. With the trumpeters, where the crown joins the beak is usually a V-shaped junction. It's got a sharper point on it than the tundras, which is more of a U-shaped junction. Also, the trumpeters, the beak itself, it's heavier and longer. So you might need to see both of them to kind of get the feel for that, but it's heavier and longer, and the slope at which it comes off the top of the head is at a consistent angle with the forehead, whereas the tundras tend to have a little bit more of a concave profile. The other characteristic feature of the tundras is yellow lores. So in front of the eyes, they'll have yellow spots. And the tundras the majority, when I say majority, like over 95% of tundras will not have a yellow spot. The odd one will throw one in there for you just to confuse things, but the tundras are the ones that will typically have that yellow pigmentation. So those are kind of the key visual features that we use. The two species are different in size. Of course, the trumpeter is larger than the tundras, but unless you have them side by side, it's not always easy to classify just based on size alone. So here's a good example of the two of them side by side. So the bird on the left has that yellow spot in front of the eye and a slightly more concave bill. The bird on the left, or sorry, on the right is larger. That beak is heavier and comes off at that straight angle. I also find personally when I'm looking at them, the tundra's eye seems to stand out a little bit more. It's more distinct, and I think that has to do with that U versus V-shaped crown. Whereas the trumpeter's eye kind of blends into the beak. So that's another sort of little feature that I tend to look for as well. But a more definitive way to identify them is by their vocalizations. So if you hear them on a water body vocalizing, then it becomes much easier to identify, even if they're too far away to see visually. So I'm going to try this. Hopefully it'll work for us, but this is the trumpeter swan. Sort of that deep bugly and resonant, versus the tundra swan, which is just a little higher, a little more softer, mellower. So by all means, I would defer to a vocalization over a visual if you had the opportunity. Oh. There. So looking a little bit at the biology of trumpeters. So if I had to use one word to characterize them, I would say it's tradition. They're a bird of tradition. So they mate for life. Lifespan in the wild is probably around that 20-year mark, but they are late breeders. So they will pair up at about 3 to 4 years of age, but that first breeding doesn't usually occur until somewhere between 5 to 7 years of age. So they form those bonds and start practicing, I guess, and scoping out the local landscape where they might want to set up a territory, but they don't actually attempt that first nesting until 5 to 7 years of age. Once they are successful in establishing a nest, they will often reuse those territories from year to year to year. So again, coming back to that tradition, if there's a swan on there one year, it's likely that they will be on there again in multiple subsequent years. The families stay bonded throughout the full first year. So cygnets that hatch and fledge with their parents will stay with them through the winter. They'll migrate together and stay together during the first winter, and then they'll strike out on their own as they return to the north in the spring. So strike out on their own, but that said, the females tend to be the traditional ones and will be the cygnets more likely to come back to the local area where they were hatched or where they fledged, and more likely to try and set up a territory eventually in that local area. As far as nesting sites, preferred nesting sites are typically sort of quiet lakes or ponds, often with sort of irregular shorelines where they can tuck into. They do like to nest on a slightly elevated feature, so that may be an beaver lodge or a muskrat push up, and they use that to form the base of their nest. Or it could be a peninsula on the shoreline, something that kind of, they get a bit more visual radius so that they can see predation or sorry, predators, or just keep an eye on things. Both the male and female will contribute to building the nest, though ultimately it's the female that spends most of the time incubating. And the nests are quite large and conspicuous. If you can envision, about 9 feet in diameter. But they are, as I mentioned, they're on a feature that kind of raises them a little bit off the water level, but in total, it wouldn't be any more than about 50 centimeters that they're off, which does leave them a bit susceptible to flooding. If we have a high water event in May or June, then that does leave that nest susceptible to flooding. So that is known to be a feature that affects nesting success. In general, they'll lay between 3 and 6 eggs. Some places they might lay a little bit more, but typically in the Waterton area, we only see them getting up to about 6. And then they'll have a 32 to 35 day incubation period. And as I mentioned, that's largely the female that does that incubating. Interestingly, that's the period of time that she is molting. So she can't fly, can't change water bodies anyhow. And so it's timed, her molt is timed to be that period that she's on the nest anyhow. The male will then molt after she has regained her flight capability. And again, this conveniently times with when the cygnets have hatched. So there's always a parent who is on the water with the nest or the cygnets. Cygnet hatch period is in late May to early June. So they will arrive in late March, early April, into the middle of April, construct the nest or reconstruct if they are using a previous nest site, and lay those eggs, and then that hatch period will come late May to early June. The cygnets, of course, hatch out as little gray fluff balls, but they'll be fully feathered by 9 to 10 weeks, with their first flight coming at 13 to 15 weeks, which puts them towards the end of September into even early October. So they have a really long, a long period that they are on the natal or hatching water body, and really are just gaining that flight strength shortly before they have to take off for migration. So if there is a swan on the water, or a swan family on the water body, they're likely to be there for the duration of the summer. I'll put a little asterisk on that and I'll come back to that. And then the cygnets will be gray through their first, so through the duration of the first summer, and even for trumpeters, they'll maintain the gray feathering even through to the end of their second summer, and then they'll molt into the typical white feathers after their second summer. Tundras will change by the end of their first winter, so you can't tell tundra cygnets from the previous year by the time they return during their migration. So as I mentioned, the breeding habitat, the nest sites, they really like those irregular shorelines. And one of the caveats, or one of the determining factors on whether a lake or water body could be a breeding site, is the takeoff distance that's required. So because they're such a heavy-bodied bird, then they do require a long takeoff distance, and we usually anticipate that they need a water body that's at least about 100 meters in length, ultimately when the cygnets are learning to fly. As I mentioned, they do like low disturbance areas. They are a bird that is sensitive to disturbance, and so it tends to be a very quiet, often secluded location where they are are nesting. They need shallow wetlands because they need to be able to pull up the tubers and roots of aquatic plants to forage on during the breeding season. A family of, we'll say, 2 adults and 3 segments that has survived can eat approximately 5 tons of vegetation over the course of the season. So they're pretty pretty voracious feeders. So they do need a healthy and productive wetland that's going to support them through that duration of time. But interestingly, the young actually feed on invertebrates for the first 3 weeks, I think it is, of their life. So they also need not only vegetation, but they do need abundant invertebrate prey for the juveniles to feed on initially. As far as migration habitat, they use what are known as stopover sites. And so these are thought to be pretty key to supporting them during their migration, because they arrive early, often before the ice is completely off their nesting water body. Then they need to arrive with sufficient reserves that they are able to persist and initiate that nesting as soon as possible, as soon as the ice is off. And so these migration water bodies, stopover sites, are thought to be particularly important to helping them maintain and even improve body condition on their route north. As far as what characteristics they're selecting, there was some research done on sites, actually some sites down near Mountain View and some sites up near Cochrane, I believe. And it appears to be that they're selecting sites that have their preferred plant rhizomes and tubers, but it's also an interaction with when that ice comes off that water body, and interestingly with the conductivity of the water body. So there does seem to be some particulars that they look for when they're seeking a stopover site. So why do swans fall into our species at risk program? I mean, anyone who has kind of kept an eye on swan populations in Canada and across the US would recognize that there's way more swans out there now than there was decades ago even. So why do they trigger for us as a species at risk? Well, in Alberta, yes, they have been downlisted from threatened to species of special concern. However, within Waterton Biosphere Reserve, we have some unique interests in that population. So they fell under our program because they were a species of concern. But we'll get to the what's happening locally in a minute here. At the bottom, at the trough of their population crash, it was thought that there was about 130 swans total across the continent. It was later found out that there was a small population up in Alaska that hadn't been counted in that 130, but certainly at the lower 48 and Canada, we were down to 130 swans total. And this was in the early 1930s. The impacts were largely due to subsistence hunting and commercial harvest of swan skins that were then sent over to Europe for various purposes, decorating hats, quills for riding, etc. But by 2015, we were up to 63,000 in the last Trumpeter Swan survey, North American Trumpeter Swan survey. So it really, they are a species at risk success story. It wasn't without work. There was hunting bans, there was reintroduction programs, lots of habitat conservation work, and industrial guidelines that we have here in Alberta helped protect the population or the habitat that the northern birds were relying upon. But in large part, things were looking pretty rosy, and so they actually stopped the Trumpeter Swan survey after the 2015 season, because they felt that it was no longer justified to continue to spend that money across the continent in wildlife management for a species that was doing okay. So this is the current distribution that came out of that last survey. You'll see sort of those two dividing lines. So there's what's called the Pacific Coast population, and they're the ones that are in Alaska and down through northern BC, winter along the coast. The sort of olive gray in the middle there down to the blue and purple, that's what's called the Rocky Mountain population. And of course, we are in the southwestern corner of Alberta. So you can see we're disjunct from birds breeding much further north. And in large part, the birds from these northern areas, and ours included, are thought to go down to that tri-state area shown in the sort of the bluish. So they definitely concentrate down there during the winter. But that's a little bit now over in Oregon. There's some new overwintering happening over there, but in large part, our birds are thought to overwinter down in the tri-state area, with the exception of, I think it's 16 that are overwintering this winter in Waterton. There have been a few there, and of course a few in Calgary as well on the Bow River, but generally they vacate to head south. And then from Saskatchewan further to the east, then that's what's known as the interior population. So we are part of the Rocky Mountain population, and when you look at what has happened with the population in northern Alberta, BC, the Yukon, definitely there's been a dramatic increase in the last 2 decades, and they seem to be doing quite well. The birds in Waterton Biosphere, the breeding population in Waterton Biosphere, on the other hand, has been stable at best. And this kind of mimics what's happened with birds in Montana or resident birds in that Yellowstone area. There is a resident flock that stays there all year, and we have not seen the same population recovery as in other places. So this is kind of one of the things that triggered on us that maybe we can't totally put swans into a, oh, they're taken care of, all is well category. Because for us locally anyhow, because our population does not seem to have responded in the same way. So what are the main threats that that have been affecting swans recently? Of course, we're not harvesting them and sending skins over for pen quills, but what are the big factors that affect them now? Well, power lines are known to be a factor for swan mortalities during their migration, and I guess around breeding sites as well, but in particular during migration. These birds are more like a passenger airplane than a fighter jet, and so they're not as nimble when they're trying to take off from a water body, or if they encounter a power line on their migration flight. Fence lines can also have that same impact on them, but power lines in particular, and there are guidelines now in Alberta with respect to breeding water bodies and power line development. Habitat loss is another big one for them, from either agricultural or industrial activities. Either way, drainage of wetlands, of course, removes the habitat that they may be requiring from the landscape. And it can be complete drainage of wetlands, or it could be loss of aquatic shoreline vegetation. As I mentioned, they really need a lot of vegetation during the breeding season to sustain themselves and young. And if the shorelines have been degraded, so the wetland itself is still there, but the shorelines have been degraded, then that impacts whether or not they can successfully raise young on that water body. But as with anything, there can be too much of a good thing. And I alluded to this earlier in terms of the nests, that if there is a high water event during the period that the female is got eggs on the nest, then that results in a loss as well. Lead poisoning, less so in Alberta, but in other areas, lead poisoning has been a significant factor, whether that's fishing tackle in the bottom of water bodies or lead ammunition from waterfowl hunting. You know, as you imagine, they're upside down digging around in the sediments and will kick up any pellets down there, and it becomes really a legacy problem for them, persisting over a long time period, even after bans on lead ammunition have been brought in. And as few as 3 pellets can kill an adult swan. So it can be a problem for them in some areas. And then finally, human disturbance at breeding sites. Now, these birds obviously are quite accustomed to human presence. I think this was a site in Ontario, maybe. But if the pair has not been used to human disturbance, which a lot of our birds around here, of course, aren't, then it will discourage them from nesting or attempting to nest there again. There was a study done in northern Alberta that showed somebody on foot at 800 meters from a nest caused the breeding pair to leave the nest. And so that results in, you know, cooling of the eggs, or if they are with hatched cygnets at that point, then, you know, there's opportunity for the family to get scattered. There's reduced feeding costs. So human disturbance is known to be a big factor for trumpeter swans. And so you might be familiar with the annual closures at Beauvais Provincial Park at the East End, from the 1st of May through to, I believe it's the 10th of July there, and then at Police Outpost from the 1st of May to July 31st. And that's to protect the swans from the disturbance during that sensitive nesting period. So, as I mentioned, you know, we do have a unique disjunct little breeding population here in Waterton Biosphere Reserve. It's small, it doesn't seem to be mighty, but we'd certainly like to get it to that point. There's a handful of nests a handful of lakes or water bodies that they use and we know get used annually. Police Outpost, Beauvais Park, Island Lake west of Twin Butte often gets used, but there's others that do sometimes see breeding attempts as well. So if we envision that this is our little breeding population here in southwestern Alberta, and we think that this is the breeding population further north in Alberta and BC, it's reasonable to think, okay, well, if something were to happen and our population were to dwindle, then we would, you know, maybe see birds move down from that larger population, but that's not the case. And when I say we have a small population, on average, so this is from the Trumpeter Swan survey that I spoke of earlier, on average, we see about 9 water bodies occupied during the breeding season. A little bit of variation from year to year, but about 9, and that equates to about 22 adults producing 2.5 successful broods a year in the biosphere. So small, not mighty, small. And on average, that would equate to about 8 cygnets successfully produced through to the end of August. So really very, very small numbers. If you think any particular event on the wintering grounds that took out a couple of pairs could have a large, or took out a couple of pairs that come back to nest here, could have a large impact on our population. So as I mentioned, we're looking at 2 or 3 nests a year, 8 cygnets produced. And if something were to happen that took out a couple of those birds or a couple of those pairs, we'd drop in our numbers pretty dramatically, pretty quickly. Would there be a possibility of birds from northern locations just deciding to stay here instead of migrating through the area? Unfortunately, there's not actually a great rescue effect in that sense. So it becomes even more important that we maintain and steward the birds that we do have, because it's from those birds that those cygnets will come back and try and set up their own territory, or ultimately replace the parent bird or parent birds on that territory. So this was one of the key reasons that that we felt that trumpeter swans did indeed deserve attention as a, quote, species at risk or species of special concern for our area. It's sort of a local responsibility for these birds. But then there's also the migration component. And prior to starting our project, we had heard that this was probably an important area for them, but there wasn't really any hard data to support that. And so we weren't really sure if we were going to get out there and find that, there was swans on every water body during migration, or what it was going to look like. When you think of an area, so this is sort of 20 kilometers from left to right here, down near Mountain View, there's lots of little water pockets where they could be stopping during migration. So we weren't sure if we were going to find just a few of those occupied, or if it was going to be more broadly, and what that looks like in the relative sense. But then if you take a 20 kilometer, so this is 20 kilometers north to south, north of Highway 3 along Highway 22, of course, there's far fewer water bodies. So again, what was that going to look like? Were they going to be on every water body? And how does that influence the relative importance of the water bodies further south in the biosphere? If there are areas sort of from Highway 3 north where there really isn't much availability. So we knew that this was probably an important area for them during migration, and we just needed to get some quantification of that. But if you step back and take the 10,000 foot view, the big picture is whether we have swans using the area during migration or whether they're here breeding. Really what they need is healthy wetlands. And by providing those healthy wetlands for them, we know that there's many other species that are going to be supported there as well. Even getting back to our bats and our northern leopard frogs in our species at risk program. So it really comes down to the wetland, healthy wetlands. And that was the intent of our project, is ultimately to support landowners in stewarding those wetlands. And if they have ideas for improvements that they'd like to make, then meeting with them and sort of discussing that and trying to connect them to technical or financial resources to help make those changes on the landscape, such that we're supporting swans and such that we're supporting all the species that rely as well. So our project, like I mentioned, it was initiated last year, and we sort of had 4 key objectives of it. 1, promote awareness of the local population that is here breeding and the importance of those migratory wetlands. Collect some data to support that. As I mentioned, promote landowner stewardship and support landowners in their management, and then ultimately develop a conservation plan that guides our actions going forward. So first off the bat was our swan migration monitoring, which we undertook last spring, well, spring and fall actually. So we did a public outreach campaign to encourage the general public to report their sightings, as well as recruited volunteers who were willing to go out and drive the roads and identify water bodies where swans were using. So obviously this is biased towards water bodies that are visible from roads. We weren't, the volunteers in general were not getting out onto private lands. Some of us were where we had permission, but we were looking to identify swan presence absence to get a relative sense of what was out there, and where possible to identify the number and age classes of those swans that were observed. So this was what we found in terms of the migration season last year. So the blue squares are trumpeter swans. The orange circles are unknown swans. So I've parsed out any of the known tundra identifications, but the reality is sometimes there are still unknown swans. This is what it would look like when a volunteer was out there. It would be a head tuck, or it would be a far off white dot, or a tip up feeding that we just couldn't tell if it was trumpeters or tundras. So those are shown in this map as the orange dots. As I mentioned, there's often mixed flocks. So we didn't want to totally remove them from the data set, because it is possible that they were trumpeters in that flock. The peak of migration came through last spring, that last week of March. So we're anticipating something similar this year. And at that peak, we were detecting almost 500 birds that week, moving through the landscape. And this is really actually important. I'm just in some discussions now with an organization about identifying the Waterton area as a key biodiversity area, and I brought forward trumpeters to them. They weren't aware that that it was as important as it is, and now because of this data that the volunteers have collected, then we have the hard data to support our proposition that this should be included in a key biodiversity area. There's a certain threshold that we have to meet in terms of number of swans using it, and we've well exceeded it. But thankfully, from the hard efforts of the volunteers, we were able to collect the data that shows that. And when I say hard effort by the volunteers, we had almost 360 volunteer hours contributed to migration monitoring last year, almost 11,000 kilometers. And this was 333 observations from volunteers, from landowners, from the public in general. So if anyone is interested, I know one of our volunteers is on here tonight. If anyone is interested in joining us this coming season, we'll be kicking off right away here for spring migration, and then fall migration is in September, October, November. Certainly touch base with me, put a comment in the chat, an email, and whatnot, and we'll get you trained up and ready to go. But it's really encouraging to see how our data is contributing to helping raise the profile that this is a unique area in terms of the swans in particular. So then during the breeding season, I did the direct contacts with landowners and surveys to identify what we were seeing in terms of breeding success and number of pairs on the landscape out there. And so these pink triangles are what we saw. There was 19 unique water bodies utilized during the breeding season. That's in comparison to, I think it was about 90 different water bodies used during migration that we knew of. And of these 19 water bodies, there were 8 breeding pairs that we were aware of. and at least one non-breeding pair, or what we call a loafing pair. And I kind of liken these to teenagers. They haven't started breeding yet. They're just hanging around, kind of scoping the area. So they would move around. So it's a little hard to pin down one water body that they're using. Like if you see a cluster, like around Mountain View, I'm pretty sure there was a loafing pair around there, as well as down towards Police Outpost area. I think there was a loafing pair there as well. So of the 8 water bodies that were used exclusively for breeding, we know that one of those nests failed, but the other 7 nests were successful in raising at least one cygnet to the end of the summer. And 3 of the water bodies that were detected, that we were made aware of, were actually on private lands, and there was no previous documented records of nesting on those water bodies. Now, talking to the landowners, a couple of them said, oh yeah, they've been here the last 2 or 3 years, but there was no official record of that. And without those landowners coming forward during this project, we wouldn't have been able to identify those sites. So these are just a couple of the 3 breeding sites that were shared with us. But I just want to point out the swans in these locations are really quite sneaky. As I mentioned, they don't like to be disturbed. And in both of these locations, the pairs were observed on the water bodies multiple times during the summer. At the one in the top left, somebody did think they had seen cygnets there in June, but then there was no more observations of cygnets there. So we thought, okay, either it was a mis-ID or they lost. But come the end of August, all of a sudden these rather large, by large, I mean these birds, the 3 on the left, were observed. And so obviously they had been there the entire season, but had been tucked away when anyone came around. So it was quite unique to get to experience that, and we're really appreciative of the landowners that shared it. And this is the 3rd site that was on private land that we weren't aware of, but again, had breeding there in at least 2 of the last 3 years. And as I mentioned before, you know, those sites where there's peninsulas and islands, they really like that. And as it turns out, this beautiful site isn't actually even a wetland per se. It's along a creek that's been dammed up. The dam is sort of a historic dam. It's been in place for over 50 years. And then it creates that wonderful irregular shoreline and peninsulas. There's actually 2 fairly significant wetlands less than 1 kilometer away, but this is where they chose to nest. And so it's going to be interesting to kind of follow up with those landowners over the next couple of years and see if the swans have indeed established a new nesting territory there that they'll maintain in perpetuity. The reason that's interesting is because when we compare our data to the previous North American Trumpeter Swan survey, now I will put the caveat on here, the methods were different. The Trumpeter Swan survey is done as a 1-day helicopter survey. And so enumerating anything that's any white that they see on the water bodies. Ours, of course, is all done from the ground. So there are differences in the methodology, but we can say we know that there was at least 9 occupied water bodies, which is on about par with previous years. I say 9 because we knew of 9 pairs on water bodies, but as I mentioned, there's at least 2, possibly 3 loafing pairs that we thought were in the areas as well. So that could be as high as 12. As far as number of adults, again, 18 that we knew were on water bodies, plus these loafing pairs hanging around as well. 7 successful broods. So this is significantly higher than the average 2 to 3, or even higher than the high end of previous years where they had detected four broods. So significantly higher. And our total number of cygnets that we detected, or that we knew persisted until the end of August, was 26, which was much, much higher than the average of 8.3 or the range of 0 to 12. So average number of cygnets per brood was right on par with what was previously seen. So this is 1 year. We don't know if this means that we are starting to come up the curve, or if it was just an anomaly because it was a good year and they didn't get nests flooded out and didn't have high predation losses. We're not sure yet, but it was certainly an encouraging year in terms of identifying swan productivity on the landscape. So what does it look like for our next year? Well, it's going to be more of the same. As I mentioned, we are recruiting volunteers, so certainly if anyone's interested in participating, it is largely roadside surveys, driving around and identifying. So it's not there's not a huge physical demand to it, but it's more of a time demand if you have available time. We're hoping to put on a workshop and bring in a swan expert, swan speaker from outside Alberta, even hopefully somebody from down in the Montana area to talk about their efforts down there. And then ultimately, as I mentioned, we'd be doing our conservation plan and looking at putting together projects with landowners that might be interested. So that's pretty much what I have for you. I just want to give a shout out to our funders. Without the funding support, of course, our project would not even be off the ground. So Shell, Wildlife Habitat Canada, Alberta Newmont Partnership, and Environment and Climate Change Canada were the big funders for our project this past year. And with that, this is one of the family's great picture of the gray cygnets. This is, I believe, taken at the end of July. So you get a good view of what the plumage looks like on those first year birds. But yeah, I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Elizabeth. What an awesome presentation, as usual. You're just chock full with knowledge. I'm going to take this opportunity just while we're waiting for questions to come in the chat that unfortunately I have to announce that our last speaker has had to cancel his presentation due to some unforeseen personal circumstances. So just to let everyone know here, if you were planning on attending the next segment of our series, it's no longer going to take place. So I will email everybody tomorrow and let them know, but I just thought I'd say that. I do have one question to kind of start off the conversation, Elizabeth. Now, I was busy dealing with technical issues, so you may have answered this and I didn't hear it, but I'm just wondering if you have noticed any populations of other animals going up where the swan populations are kind of dwindling or staying the same. Is there any correlation with like another species that may be taking over or deterring them from thriving?
Yeah, I don't think it's a competition issue with another species that's crowding them out. Certainly those other threats have the habitat loss, the impacts from mortality due to power lines or fishing tackle. Those sorts of things, I think, are far bigger drivers than competition with swans.
And I see there's a volunteer request in the chat.
Yeah, I'm just going to write that.
Awesome. Okay, and then Kathy does have a question too when you're ready. She asked,
okay, go ahead.
Do they use either the Old Man Dam or Waterton Dam sites, or are they adverse to the water fluctuation?
A good question, Kathy. We do see them using those sites, particularly the Old Man Dam area. There's a couple different places like near the Cottonwood Campground and near the castle, where the Castle River comes in there. We do see them using those sites quite regularly during migration, but not during breeding. Those aren't sites that get used. And it is probably a scenario of not enough aquatic vegetation to support them, and then in combination with the water level fluctuations that you mentioned.
Do they ever, like, are they, and again, you might have answered this already, but in terms of where other large birds are they, I'm assuming they're kind of territorial somewhere where large groups of like Canadian geese are. Swans, do they tend to stay away from each other?
So yes, swans can be quite territorial towards Canada geese. Loons maybe a little bit less so, because you think of loons being a bird that also kind of likes those quiet or secluded water bodies as well. So a little less territorial towards the loons, but certainly they will be aggressive towards Canada geese when they're at least initially setting up, and certainly towards any other swans coming onto those water bodies during the breeding season. Even juvenile swans from a previous brood, when they're kicked out, they're kicked out, and there's not usually room for two breeding pairs on any of the water bodies that we have seen them on here. Some places where there's bigger wetland complexes, you may get them on adjacent wetland areas, but yeah, not usually two sets of breeders on a water body here.
Okay, and Kathy has another question. What are your thoughts on their overwintering here? Do you think this will become common?
That's a good question, Kathy. I certainly, from a population stability standpoint, it certainly would be nice if there were a few more that were decided that they could persist through the winter here. Just, it's better to have that overwintering happening in multiple places. Anytime it's concentrated into one place, if you think of an extreme freeze event or something down in Yellowstone, there are going to be a lot of birds impacted by that. So if there's smaller pockets of birds overwintering in multiple places, then it just sort of allows for some more resiliency in the population. So I am encouraged that that there are birds overwintering now down in Waterton. But again, it's not a large number, and we certainly don't know if those are birds that breed here and continue here during the winter, or whether those are birds from further north that stop and overwinter here. We'd have to do some neck collaring to figure that out.
Okay. And Dennis asks, What body of water do they use in Waterton? I have only seen them on the Middle Waterton Lake.
Yeah, so in the winter, I assume you're asking, Dennis, they will use that Middle Waterton Lake. They'll also use the river, the area called the Dardanelles. They'll use that area. It's quite secluded back there, and that's actually where they were spotted a while ago. So that group of 16 or so. They will also sometimes use the ponds near the entrance gate. Just kind of depends on ice conditions.
Kathy wants to know, do we have any banded individuals that we are able to track, follow, and check up on?
No, we don't, Kathy. So occasionally you will see a bird with a colored neckband come through. If you ever do, just use your binos. You can read the number. It's usually alphanumeric. Read that number. And then the Trumpeter Swans Society website, I believe it's on there that you can report where it is. And different color bands come from different breeding populations, but we don't have any of our birds currently collared. It's something we would love to have, because I'd love to know where they were going over winter, and what the return rate and that is. But no, we don't have that. It's kind of outside of our scope. It's a bit more into the research end of things, but it's certainly on my bucket list to capture a local swan and get a band on it.
That would be interesting to be able to like kind of map out its travel time. That would be cool to know. Okay, so I'll just leave it open for a couple more minutes just in case there's any questions that just kind of trickling in here. I do want to thank everybody for being here tonight. I know it was kind of a nice evening around here anyway until it started raining. So I want to thank everyone for joining us for our third installment of the 2022 Winter Speaker Series. And I want to thank Elizabeth again for joining us once again and regaling us with her wealth of knowledge. I could stay and ask her questions all night about many things. Thanks, Liz and Sam. This was very informative, Kathy says. And that's all the questions. I will say that again, that if you want to rewatch this presentation, or if you haven't missed any of the other two prior presentations towards the middle of March, they will be posted up on the Chinook Arch YouTube page. And once they are posted there, I will be sure to include a link to them on the Pincher Creek Library Facebook page, as well as I can email everybody who registered for our series. I can email them the link as well, so that you can rewatch our series at your leisure and share it with anyone who was unable to attend. So I think this is the end of our presentation. So thank you, Elizabeth, for coming, and we will for sure reach out to you one day again, and it looks like the next time we might even be in person. So that would be exciting, right?
Excellent.
So, thanks again.
All right. Thanks, Sam. And thanks everyone for joining tonight.
Okay, good night. I hope